Welcome to this sixth and final event in the RESET.21 forum series, where we are focused on the emergency that we face and building on the significant momentum and energy around last year's 2020 Climate Emergency Summit. We are at the Melbourne lockdown end of the summit, folks, and in a global pandemic, we have, of course, become adept at pirouetting events into a live stream. So thank you, wherever you join us, for joining us in this live stream event tonight. It is going to be a cracker. My name is Natasha Mitchell. I'm a science journalist, and I am joining you from a kitchen table here on the land of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. There is no climate solution without your ongoing leadership and knowledge in the driver's seat. Thank you for having us on your land. The organising team would love to thank major partners, City of Melbourne, RMIT University, Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration and the Safe Climate Fund, and the Capitol Theatre, which of course was going to host us live tonight, but instead we're here on live stream. Tonight's event is part of the National Sustainable Living Festival, which is on throughout this month. The hashtag for the event tonight, #RESET21, tweet away. We want to build some momentum around this conversation. Our session tonight, Below Zero 2030, emergency action for negative emissions. Emergency action. That means now. That means treating climate change like we are treating this pandemic. In fact, it might mean, as you're going to hear from our speakers, helping us to rebuild after this pandemic by turning to climate change as an opportunity for economic, societal change. Negative emissions, that means we need to reach a point soon where we have not only dramatically reduced emissions to zero within the next 10 years, but we are also needing to pull out the carbon that we have already overcommitted to the atmosphere and which will spin us out well beyond 2 degrees. So we need to aim for net zero and then some negative emissions. So what we want to talk about tonight with three fantastic speakers are the top technological disruptions, the rapidly deployed economic and social innovations that will get us to zero in the next 10 years. And then what will it take to achieve drawdown of carbon globally at a monumental and rapid scale? Now, the great thing is that our three speakers have done some heavy-duty thinking, modelling. They've put numbers to this. They've thought through what the next 5 and 10 years might look like. And so what we're going to hear are three speakers, a keynote, and two more speakers. Then we're opening it out to Q&A for amongst us, the panel, and then we're opening it out even further into the Slido platform. So we want to hear your questions. And to do that, you need to go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, put in the code RESET21 and you are in. So get posting, and I can see that Philip Sutton has already started posting already. So please participate. We want you to help drive this conversation. Our keynote speaker tonight is, drumroll, a big thinker with an eye for detail, Dr. Saul Griffiths, who will make a moonshot, a war effort style pitch to get us where we need to be. Saul is an Australian-American engineer, inventor, serial entrepreneur. He's a father. He is a founder and chief scientist at Rewiring America, a coalition to address climate change and jumpstart the economy by pretty much electrifying everything. He's founder and chief scientist at Other Lab. They're an independent R&D lab, and through that he helps government agencies and Fortune 500 companies and a whole lot more understand energy infrastructure and develop new technologies for deep decarbonisation and much more. Please welcome Saul Griffith. Thanks, Saul.
Thanks, Natasha. My name is Saul Griffith. I'm actually now living, thanks to COVID, in Wollongong. my plan at the beginning of last year was to move to Washington, DC in March. That plan ended in late February. I know I was going to be doing a year walking the Hill and trying to engage with American politicians on both sides to rewire America. But today I'm going to talk to you about what we learned while doing a lot of that work that was virtual, as it turned out last year. And I'm going to try and put it in the Australian context and how do you decarbonize Australia really quickly. With that, I'm going to share some slides and I'm going to go through all together too quickly, probably, but you can play it in slow motion on YouTube after you've seen the talk. Like COVID, the problem with COVID is that you want to keep the hospitals open and not overrun that infrastructure. Climate change is far worse. We're even trying to use the moment of COVID as a learning moment for dealing with climate change. How do we bend the curve of climate change and stay within the infrastructure limit, which implies a temperature? And then for that, you need to know what sort of temperature do you want to hit. And here are the 2100 warming projections that we have based on the Paris pledges and targets might give us a 2.5 to 2.8 degree outcome, even though 2 degree was the goal, and 1.5 degrees is where we would really like to go. What is the cause of all those emissions? These are CO2 emissions by sector and type. So it's a little bit of our land use and our waste and landfill. It's industrial emissions like refrigerants and steel, but the giant majority, 85% is combustion of fossil fuels. I like to think this is where we are at on climate. We're close to being able to win, but we might just be a decade late. So it's at retail, it's nearly affordable now for the solutions, just not quite. And our climate emergency and awareness ambition is rising. Unfortunately, they meet a little too far out. So how do we bring that forward is the question. First, why do you need to bring it forward? Without even talking about committed emissions, 1.5 degrees is extremely difficult. What committed emissions are is there's already a whole bunch of machines that exist in the world, cars that will still need to be driven, furnaces that are still running on natural gas, coal plants that are still running or have just been built. The emissions from machines that exist today alone, so if we build no more machines to burn any more fossil fuels and just let the existing ones burn them out through their lifetime, that takes us to about 1.8 degrees, probably closer to 2. So the politically possible is still trumping what is technically necessary. What is technically necessary is as quickly as possible to get to a position where we have an 100% adoption rate of clean technology. What does that 100% adoption rate mean? It means every next vehicle that someone buys is an electric vehicle. Every next furnace that someone buys is an electric heat pump powered by renewable electricity. To put that in context, here are technology adoption rates historically for things like the color TV. It took about 25 years for the color TV and the cell phone to get to 100% adoption. And what we need to have happen to hit the climate target we need end-use electrification to play out at that same speed. And I'm about to tell you what does that end-use electrification look like. And just to talk about it, it also needs to feel incredibly fast. So imagine electrifying everything at the speed we saw the cell phones unroll. But first, a bit of history. 1970 was the first energy crisis, and in fact, at that time, we didn't really even have energy data. So Richard Nixon, in fact, started the Energy Information Agency in the US and the Department of Energy and tasked them with figuring out what the problem was. And they sort of divided the problem into two sides: supply, which is where you get your energy from, and demand, which is what you use it for. They even created these sorts of diagrams known as Sankey diagrams, which are read from left to right as supply through to demand. So over here is oil and coal and natural gas on the left. Over on the right is residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. They even invented the language by which we now discuss the decarbonization debate. We think about the transportation sector, we think about the residential sector, the commercial sector, and industrial. But that's a little bit of a misnomer. And I just show you this. So this was the 1976 diagram. This is the 2015 diagram. And honestly, the only progress we made was in giving it color. We don't think deeply enough about the demand side. So the oil crisis was the supply side problem, 15% shortage of oil because of the Middle East embargo. And so they thought the answer was to become 15% more efficient. That gave us CAFE fuel standards, and that gave us Energy Star appliances, which is basically fuel economy for your car and for your furnace or your cooktop. But that's not nearly enough. So in 2018, with the Department of Energy, looked at all possible energy flows in incredible detail for the US economy. And you have no chance of reading this, but you can see it online at departmentof.energy. But we could actually tell you how much energy is used to move waste and scrap, how much energy is used in slaughterhouses and chicken farms. Incredible detail through the whole economy. With that view, you can now start running decarbonization scenarios with great detail. And what you can say is demand-side electrification changes everything. So this is a pretty remarkable result. If you remember, the environmentalist movement grew up with that oil crisis. First Earth Day was 1970. And so they inherited this efficiency, save 15%, make more efficient cars, make more efficient appliances narrative from that 1970s narrative. But that's not what we need now. We need complete transformation. So it turns out if we generated all of our electricity without fossil fuels, you'd save 25% of the emissions or of the energy. You eliminate that energy. If you electrify the vehicle fleet, you eliminate another 16% of your energy needs. If you electrify the heat in homes, another 6 or 7%. This is sort of an incredible news story that's not really sung enough. If we don't think about efficiency, which is the 1970s narrative, and we think about a 2020s narrative of electrification of everything, you need less than half of the energy you thought you did to run the economy. This is not shrinking homes. This is not shrinking cars. This is the same homes, the same cars, electrified. Demand must change as fast as supply. So let's go into the details of that demand. I'm going to look from the household out. Too often we have abstract climate conversations about coal plants and export industries, but really let's talk about how it impacts you. Most likely, if most Australian houses are like American houses, there's 1.8 cars in the garage, there's 2.6 people living in the house, it's run on fossil fuels for the heating, there's natural gas probably running the cooking and maybe the hot water. And because of that, you spend a lot of money on fossil fuels. In Australia, it's about $6,000 a year per family. In America, it's about $4,500 US. The average American family spends more on gasoline than it does on fresh food. It spends more on electricity than it does on education, and more on natural gas than it does on dentistry. So it's a significant impact to the average household whose average after-tax income is 60 grand. So we actually looked at, for every state in the US, and I've recently done this for Australia, which we'll get to, all of the energy used by every single type in the house. You can see the household, the majority energy use is gasoline or petrol, which is the big blue bar. The electricity is yellow, and natural gas for heating is red. So how do you decarbonize that home? Well, you have to electrify 2 cars in the garage, put solar on the roof, put a heat pump in for the heat, electrify the cooking, add a battery, upgrade the load center, and connect it to the grid. That's a pretty simple recipe of 8 pieces of 21st century infrastructure. And I use the word infrastructure carefully, and we'll come back to that later. Turns out the current amount, that's the current energy use on the left for an American home. That is the future use on the right. We haven't shrunk anything. We're just using the efficiency of the electricity. We can look at that then in savings. Oh, and we end up with a remarkable result. Sorry, my computer slowed down. So by the prices, we will see batteries, wind and solar and grid electricity in 2024 in the US, you would be saving $1,000 per home in the US, and by about 2028, about $2,500 per home per year on their energy if we could make the transition to completely electrified homes. We just did the study cursorily for Australia, and you would see similar results. So with rooftop solar providing half your energy, electrified vehicles in the Australian garages and driveways, with electrification, heat and cooking, the average Australian household would save $2,000 a year. That adds up to $20 billion per year in total savings to households. That's a significant number, and I want you to think about it. And you want to think about, why don't we have that conversation in Australia? That's because Australia's energy flow diagram looks like this. It is completely dominated by that giant grey bar at the top, which is our energy exports. So everything else we do is below that. That's the domestic economy, and grey is the export economy. We export 600% of the energy we use domestically. Those fossil exports import $80 billion and makes a huge lobbying industry that's not really helping us here. But what they never mention when they talk about our coal and liquid natural gas exports is we use nearly half of that money to buy oil. So this is why the conversation about electric vehicles in Australia is so dysfunctional. So that fixes half the problem. So think about that $20 billion we would be saving in households. We're already in a position to be net positive, but Australia hasn't played nicely. We fudged the IPCC by pushing negative emissions and excluding exports from the accounting, so we don't do true accounting, which is the bad side of what Australia has done. The good side is we're leading the world in rooftop solar. The training and certification programs here have us at $1 a watt installed. That is the envy of the world. In America, it's $3 a watt. So when I give this talk in America and I'm angry, I say Australians are great, they did solar right. But we're failing on electric vehicles. We're failing on electrifying heat. And we are not yet realizing the economic benefits that we could for the household. It sort of shocks me that a party from neither party has yet latched on to making this a retail political conversation about the Australian family and saving the family in Geelong or Penrith or Parramatta $2,000 a year while decarbonising. I think we can and should lead the world in decarbonising, and we should save money while doing it. And I'm going to go out with a little bit of a radical idea, but with some data. This is vehicle age distributed by household income. And no surprises, the wealthier your household, the newer your vehicles. And you can actually map that to electric vehicles. So for households with $300,000 income or more, there's a 70% chance their next car is electric. But for the median household, it's about 25%. The reality is that the homes that can afford to decarbonize today, the energy prices don't matter. The homes for which the savings really matter can't afford to decarbonize. The reason I used the word infrastructure earlier in the conversation is to tie this to a pretty radical idea that was developed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1930, which is he invented the modern home loan. So in 1936, to stimulate America out of the economic problems of the Great Depression, they created Fannie Mae, which was the government promising to help guarantee banks providing financing to homes for 25-year loans. That was a hugely radical move, in effect declaring the American suburbs national infrastructure, by which they created the largest pool of capital the world has ever seen, still today. And honestly, that's the thing we need to have. The future is a competition between fuels and finance. If we could finance these upgrades to all of our homes, we can decarbonize. And then the cost depends upon the interest rate, which is why it's important for the government to play nicely and guarantee low interest rates. And then we have to make the finance available to all families. If only the wealthiest 50% of families can afford this, we do not solve climate change and we perpetuate inequities. Done well with low-cost financing, we could repair some of our old injustices as well. This is how we could rewire Australia, and I can't wait with you all to change the dialogue here and have Australians overthrow both sides of the politics until some new party arises who's going to fix this at the speed and scale we need. Thank you.
Saul Griffith. Yes, and you can read in great detail in Saul's new book, Rewiring America, and look at some of those models that he's developed with colleagues. Looking forward to unpacking that further with you, Saul. Thanks very much. And the thing about reading Saul's work is that it really does make you believe and understand that it is possible to decarbonise an economy if the will is there. So we'll discuss that further. Heidi Lee is CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions, where she is working with the manufacturing sector, amongst others, to electrify Australian factories and power them with renewables. A former architect, Heidi has a long history with Beyond Zero Emissions and the Zero Carbon Australia collaboration. She's worked on all sorts of projects, both with and beyond Zero Emissions, but including project managing Beyond Zero's 2013 plan to decarbonise all of Australia's buildings. She's going to present to you some of the tidbits from a very ambitious plan, and it's a staggering read. I commend it to you. The Million Jobs Plan, launched last year with much fanfare from all sorts of people from the corporate sector, which was interesting to see. So please welcome to your virtual stage, Heidi Lee.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I'm sorry we can't all be together in the Capitol Theatre as well as streaming into your lounge room, but this is a really fantastic way to spend a Tuesday. So I'm joining you tonight from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people here and pay my respects to elders past, present and those emerging. As Natasha said in my intro, Beyond Zero Emissions is something I've been a part of for a long time. We are an energy think tank. We show how Australia is going to prosper in this transition to zero emissions. This isn't about sacrifice. This is about how wonderful it's going to be. And I think that Saul's given us a taste of that by diving into all the benefits that you get in your home when you electrify and power everything with renewable energy. So if you have not heard about Beyond Zero Emissions, we've been around for about 10 years and we've written decarbonisation plans for every sector of the economy, from stationary energy and buildings and transport and even a land use paper. And most recently, our work was focusing on the manufacturing sector. We work with zero carbon community groups all around Australia, and we've also published 3 regional decarbonisation plans that kind of take these big ideas out of our sector-based research and hone them in on communities that are most impacted by a fossil fuel transition and look for where the opportunities are in those same places for the workforce and for the local economy to thrive. So last year, in the midst of COVID, we did our most high-profile piece yet, and that was the Million Jobs Plan. It is a massive collaboration. It's an ongoing piece of work. This brought together energy experts, engineers, our communities and investors and the public sector, private sector, and all of that work showed how, with the right government support and private sector getting involved, we can create 1.8 million jobs over the next 5 years. Most of these would be high quality jobs and ones that all set up our workforce and our economy and our infrastructure to accelerate this transition to a zero emissions economy and put us on the path to becoming a renewable energy superpower. So the highlights out of that project: 940,000 jobs in new buildings and home energy retrofits, 230 in clean manufacturing and mining, 200 in land regen, 140,000 in sustainable transport, and all of this underpinned by about 200,000 jobs in delivering, fast-tracking 90 kilowatts of renewable energy transmission and associated storage. So that is the highlights. That's the good news story that comes on the other side of the types of experiences that we're having now in the midst of COVID. Former Treasury economist Chris Murphy did an independent review of our work and found that the Million Jobs Plan, as we described it, is going to boost private investment by $25 billion annually. That's about 2% of GDP, increases real wages by about 1%, and does a bunch of other really great things for the economy, for workers. The summary line I liked the best, I wrote it down here: the Million Jobs Plan delivers results almost immediately, and its benefits persist for many years. So when you can find an independent economic review of our work that tells us that this is a great idea, not just today, but into the future, that's the kind of inspiration we take to keep going with this work. The response in public, as Natasha said, has been pretty incredible. We've had significant engagement with the federal government, and our work's been profiled in conservative and progressive media, and our network of supporters has really exploded. So we've been able to see the impact that putting out a good news story like this at a time when we really need it and weaving together the opportunities of a situation, of a really tough situation, showing what that can do. So while we do think the government's moving in the right direction, we need to go faster, and there's a whole lot more we can do. So the ongoing work that we're doing with the Million Jobs Plan is basically reaching out to communities, as we did through the creation of our Million Jobs report and our project analysis piece that we did afterwards. That outreach is ongoing. So right now we're looking at like hundreds of really great ideas that have come to us, not just from a standalone research team that sits outside of the community, but from our distributed network of research volunteers and communicators and outreach staff. These people are all through Australian communities and towns. There's one near you, no doubt. Out of those big ideas that came from all across Australia, I'm going to talk to you about 4 themes, and they kind of dovetail, Saul, with some of the stuff that you raised, and I'm sure, Justin, a bit of a prelude to what you're going to talk about too. So the 4 themes that I'm going to talk about. Theme number 1 is that the sun and the wind can power heavy industry. Theme number 2, we can make all electric transport right here in Australia. Number 3 is about turbine manufacturing. And number 4 is turning waste into steel and just about anything you like. So these are real projects that we get to go out and see, because when you go and ask, put the call out and say, send us your great ideas, people respond, and they respond in a really big way. So first of all, we're going to talk about the sun and the wind powering heavy industry. So most manufacturing processes, as you know, they require very high temperature heat, which is usually generated by burning fossil fuels. However, in our 2018 electrifying industry report, that showed that you could transition just about any of those industrial heat processes to 100% to all electric and then 100% renewable energy. So we're looking in our Million Jobs Plan at a 5-year program to electrify Australian industry, create a large workforce of designers and engineers and technicians, and that alone delivering around 12,000 ongoing jobs around the country. So this is the upside to actually aggressively attacking this problem and saying we can do this. So one example that I really like is a small company called MGA Thermal. They can help us shift to renewable energy by providing a new way to store that energy as heat. That's clean, that's economical, it's scalable. They basically make thermal bricks, thermal blocks, and they stack them into insulated storage tanks, and that stores heat at about 600 degrees Celsius, which is a useful temperature for industrial heat processes, and even to put inside power station underneath the turbines. So you can use this kind of technology, storing energy as heat, to make old coal-fired power stations powered with renewable energy. If you charge your bricks with solar power during the day, these bricks will make steam overnight and power these turbines. And they're actually looking at a couple of opportunities in the Hunter Valley to start to road test that technology with old power stations. So that's a really exciting one. Theme number 2, we're going to make all electric transport here in Australia. We heard about the benefits why from an energy point of view, but it's cleaner, it's quieter, it's less polluting in the streets, and it costs less to run when powered by renewables. If we electrified all land transport in Australia, we would increase electricity demand by about 1/3 while drastically reducing the need for imported oil. So this boosts our fuel security and takes our overall emissions down by around 15%. So a huge opportunity here. If in the next 5 years we chose just to electrify public transport buses, we could deliver 19,000 jobs. If we wanted to, we could go further. We could get more jobs, or we could be making the batteries for them. We could be assembling the all-electric engines here in buses, but also in trucks and cars. And so we could really take that industry to the next level here in Australia. And we think one way to spark that is to make that commitment to electrify every public transport bus in the country. Theme number 3, and I think a favourite among many people on the call tonight, will be the turbine manufacturing story. Most of the cost of wind farm development relates to the purchase of the turbines. Turbine manufacture, it's really labour intensive, and large turbine manufacturers, they'll only make components locally once the market reaches a sufficient size. So at the moment, Australia doesn't have a lot of capacity to manufacture wind turbines, existing capacity. So right now we're missing out on the economic and employment opportunities that come from wind farm developments. But if we were to bring wind manufacturing jobs onshore, we could create over 9,000 jobs in the next 5 years. Many of them would be factory jobs with medium to low skill requirements. So a quick way to do this is to convert our existing disused factories, and it's already happened in Geelong, where part of the old Ford factory is now making components for Victorian wind farms. So wind turbine manufacturer Vestas has indicated that given significant demand, they would be able to expand their manufacturing in Australia. We can have a whole industry around this. My fourth theme for the night is turning waste into green steel. Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore, but doesn't make much steel. Most new steel is made using coal, and this production causes 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If we combine Australia's exceptional resources in both iron ore and renewable energy, Australia can become a pioneer in making zero emissions steel. A green steel industry could create up to 25,000 manufacturing jobs, or 37,000 if all of the iron were converted into steel. But the project here that really caught my eye is one by Professor Veena Sajwala. She's the director at the Centre of Sustainable Materials Research and Technology at UNSW. They are making a new generation of green materials, including those made primarily or almost entirely from waste. So they're really famous for their breakthrough thinking. But one of the most exciting processes that I've seen, and I've gone and held in my hand, is they make green steel out of old car tyres. So I was visiting the Mollycop factory in Newcastle the year before last year, 2019, and that factory there is pioneering her technology and looking to commercialise this. So you turn your car tyre into this kind of black lump, a very friendly, benign black lump, not like a lump of black coal. And this here creates the carbon ingredient in green steel. So that's a really exciting development, and one that Australia could start to pioneer either from our extensive iron ore reserves or through looking at innovative ways to use our waste. I was asked by a federal politician recently whether it was about development or deployment. What's best? And I cannot stress my answer enough. It is, you don't choose between development and employment. You do both. You do more, you do it faster. You commission new research and development into emerging technologies while at the same time deploying proven technologies at scale and speed. Over the next few months, BZE is really going to be focused very tightly on the manufacturing sector opportunities. We have designed a national program for renewable energy industrial precincts with our partners at WWF Australia. We are promoting clusters of manufacturing facilities powered by 100% affordable, reliable, renewable energy and making clean, green hydrogen that we can export to rapidly decarbonise the global markets. And export's really important, as Saul named. We need to address our export economy at the same time as decarbonise our domestic economy. The precinct approach is going to deliver huge efficiencies of scale, and when it's designed well, this can also provide reliability services that are so important to a renewable energy grid. So these 4 themes are just a small sample of really big opportunities that we're going to set us on a path to a zero emissions future in as soon as the next 10 years.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Thanks for that really rich detail too. We've got lots to discuss when it comes to questions and answers. So please keep your questions coming into the Slido platform. If you've just joined us, you need to head to slido.com, that's slido.com, and enter RESET.21. Next up, we've gone kind of from the energy inside your household, the energy in manufacturing. Now we're flowing on into landscape scale interventions. And Justin Borwitz is Professor of Biology at the Australian National University via the University of California, San Diego, and the Salk Institute and the University of, other universities as well. He's one of Australia's foremost experts on genetics, plant biology and soils, 3 of my favourite topics. His work at the ANU Centre of Excellence in Plant Energy Biology uses genomics to study how landscapes and plants adapt to variable and changing climate. So this is vital, vital knowledge. And his team are also developing very interesting integrated systems, if you like, that better connect agriculture and natural ecosystems. So using natural processes to better draw out carbon from the atmosphere, capture it and store it into soils and crops and other mechanisms. It's really powerful and interesting work, and I think you'll be very interested in the possibilities. Please welcome to our virtual stage here at RESET.21, Justin Borwitz. Thanks, Justin. Take it away.
Thank you, Natasha. And thank you, Heidi and Saul, for leading off tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. And we have a lot to learn still from Indigenous people about how to better manage these dynamic and changing landscapes. Look, I'm also speaking to you from my house, and this is a totally passive solar house. It's tell people 180% renewable and 80% sustainable. We're slightly living off the grid for a couple of months in the winter, but most of the year we're pushing more sun back, and this house didn't cost anything extra. The next step is to draw down carbon. And Australia actually has an outsized role, a relatively huge country to a small population. So cleaning up our own act is the first simple step, and Beyond Zero Emissions laid that out a decade ago when I first came to Australia, and I think we'll quickly get there. Can we go farther? Can we go deep negative? I'll tell you about what I think we can scale to negative gigaton per year in Australia. That's 10% of the world's drawdown solution. So let me jump into the slides. Well, regenerative agriculture is very popular now. I'm on the board of Soils for Life, and we're promoting this among farmers around the world. It's many things. I think it's not only being less bad and reducing emissions, especially methane and nitrous oxide, where agriculture is a big part of the problem, but drawing down CO2 from the air and leaving it in soils. That's the drawdown part. And that's how we go from being a source to a sink for carbon. The way to integrate this, I call precision landscape regeneration. It's got a social component, and we helped with Heidi's Million Jobs program, 200,000 jobs. I think could even be 1 million jobs in agriculture alone if we get back out on the land and really work this. I think European governments are already looking for where they can buy drawdown overseas because they don't have enough space. Well, we have space, and we can get to work to try to buy ourselves some time. It's a combination of trees and soils, and then the storage is in biochar and rock weathering, when I'll talk about. So we heard about renewable energy and reducing emissions from fossil fuels, really well laid out by Saul, and all the energy freedom plans from BZE. I'm telling you about it. I put it into practice in this house. Electrifying, obviously, heat pumps, I don't think it has enough attention. Solar is great. Double pane windows, folks. Come on. And you know, ventilation systems, very important for COVID. We need to think about it for energy as well. Electrification of transport is not only for efficiencies, but storage. You can charge your car when the sun's shining. Anyway, that's half of the solution. The other half is to flip agriculture from a source to a sink. We are taking for granted, really, that land is cleaning up about 1/4 of our emissions right now, and the ocean another 1/4. And so we can accelerate that. The land use change, because agriculture keeps expanding into new areas, is something that improving our agricultural productivity will indirectly reduce that land use change, and then flipping agriculture to be a sink is what I'll talk about today. And this is also a big part of preserving biodiversity and regenerating natural landscapes, because we shouldn't be farming in a lot of these areas that are unprotected. So what that means, if we think about this from a Earth systems perspective, and my colleague Elko Rowling here put up with me and other partners a grand challenge called Enhanced Earth Systems. And this is acknowledging first that the biosphere is 10 times larger than humanity's, maybe 12 times larger than humanity's footprint. It's a big cycle that moves huge amount of carbon. We actually cycle the whole atmosphere through vegetation in soils every 5, 6, 7 years or so. The problem is that it's not stored. We could increase photosynthesis by providing water nutrients and reduce the losses by storing some of that biomass as biochar and some of the soil carbon as weathered rocks. And I'll take you through. We also, of course, talked already about reducing our fossil fuels, but small tweaks in the Earth system can deliver huge benefits. This is the Earth cycling. If you haven't seen this, Nature's Heartbeat, it's wonderful. I look Australia, you can see it's not dead like the Sahara Desert. This year, when you get really wet rains, there is quite a bit of green up. We're probably going to pull down as much carbon this year as we lost in the fires last year. That's not going to be stable as like the trees were, but it's this first step forward. And so we really need to take advantage of that. Our center works on this energy biology system. It's the largest metabolic system on the planet and produces all the resources we need out of thin air and sunlight. The fuel one has not been the right direction. We want to stop giving our food to cows and cars, but replace that with soil fertility and better grazing pressures. So that's the drawdown piece that I'll talk about. So there's intensifying cycles of droughts, fires, and floods. Land clearing, we're racing Brazil to beat the record in land clearing, but that's hopefully slowed and the regrowth will start. Agriculture diverts a lot of the net primary productivity of the planet, and that just shows the potential that is there, the photosynthetic potential of our croplands that are operating below capacity, but we can reverse that. Agriculture is half of the planet. Most of that is grazing land, and in Australia it's 90%. More than half of our continent is under hoof. That's opportunity. That's an opportunity. We can go all the way to half Earth, as E.O. Wilson says. So we need precision designs to do this. If we're going to make recommendations for farmers to flip, how would they do it? How would I do this on my farm? Or if I was thinking of investing and buying a piece of land, what would it take? How much would it cost? This is the finance versus fuels paradigm that we heard before. I think it's a finance versus fertility, and we're starting to get a lot of demand. The international carbon market in Sweden is $120 or something. In California, it's close to 80, but Australia, it's like 16 or 17, so we're selling carbon overseas. We could really boost this, and we need to maximize our water, light, and mineral use efficiency to do it. Coupling 4 different technologies, they're known, they're well understood. It's trees and soils, which is really the grass and the grass roots and good grazing management. Those are the capture solutions. The storage solutions above ground is to do biochar, and below ground is rock weathering. So these all couple together, and it's the interactions that need to be specified and modeled. The plant system runs on solar energy. We need to use the rain that we get, better rehydration of farms. Most of these landscapes have been severely altered from the original land clearing, and they've never been rebuilt. And some regenerative farmers are rehydrating their landscapes and starting to draw down lots of carbon. This can be modeled now. There's a lot of new modeling happening out of the Lawrence Livermore labs and in California, where I was on sabbatical earlier last year. So that's coming. New approaches in molecular biology to look at the microbiomes and soil microbiomes, which we really have never considered soil as being alive before. But when the soil becomes active, it can process that carbon and leave it in a more stable form. And this just kind of shows the modeling, how you can draw down carbon. And when you apply agricultural practices, you can do better than natural regeneration. A lot of times we do worse because we're focused on yield, yield, yield. But if we want to focus on water use efficiency and carbon, that's wide open new breeding targets. So that requires good agriculture, and we need to figure out how to integrate trees back into the landscape, pastures and crops together in different zones, link these into networks. and start to do agroforestry like it's done in France, and silver pasture. This is up in Armadale. There's many examples, and we just need maps for people and models so they can know what their return on investment would be. And if we scale that out to the potential, like 100 million hectares in Australia of crop and pasture and forestry land, we can do 10 tons per hectare, which is a gigaton of carbon. And at $100 a ton, which I'm sure the price in 2030 will be, it already is in many parts of the world now, that's $100 billion and a million jobs for people to all work on a square kilometer farm over the decade. It's the next step, I think, beyond the passive house, and a way to reboot Australia. So primary industries have been part of the problem, and this is a flip to become part of the solution. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Yes, the soil is alive, people. So thank you so much for that presentation, Justin. And I know there's a whole lot of detail that you can't cover in 8 or so minutes, but let's try and drill into it a little bit further together. So let's open up the floor for discussion. We'll have a bit of a chat here. We've got about 40 minutes left for our session, so we're going to weave in some of your questions along the way too. So please, just a reminder, if you've just joined us, head over to slido.com, slido.com, put in RESET.21 and start those questions flowing. So let's just, where do we start, people? And I guess, and I will throw in a question at the very beginning, because from Anonymous, so what can we learn from historical examples of emergency responses like wartime speed and scale? And I think this is interesting because I wouldn't mind a comment from you all on, here we are living through a global pandemic. It has been very interesting watching systems within the public health context mobilise, sometimes not aided by the politics of the time, but certainly we've mobilised. So what are you all thinking about in the context of this pandemic, about how we've mobilised around a pandemic and how we might mobilise around climate change? Saul.
You should let Australians talk about, although I am Australian, you should let the half of me that is Australian should talk about how Australia did great mobilising around COVID, and the half of me that is American should perhaps not mention it. But specifically,
well, it's interesting you say that. It's very interesting you say that, because you're all about looking at examples in American history, particularly wartime examples where America mobilised effectively, and your argument's kind of gone out the window with the pandemic.
I just finished a book for MIT Press called Electrify, and it's really based around how quickly can you do this transition. And so first it starts with what is necessary in terms of a timeline, but then what is the best that you can practically do? And that's why I can tell you absurd facts, like the average car is 12 years old in the US, and the average furnace is 18 years old, and the average hot water heater is 14 years old. And that's the rate that we're probably going to have to try and replace those things. But the other side of it is, for the big things that we need, so wind turbines, solar cells, and batteries, we're about 16x off the production rate of solar to be providing the world with all of its energy, half from solar, and we're about 12x off on wind energy from in terms of production rate, and we're about 10x off on batteries. So we need to double the size of each of those industries about 3 times to get there. That is an unprecedented level of doublings, although the industries are growing at 10 to 20% each. We just need them to grow at 200%. And the analogy from World War II, so honestly, Hitler walked into France, Churchill panicked, called Roosevelt and said, I need your help. We can't make this, and this war is being fought with machines. We need machines. So Franklin D. Roosevelt launched something called the Arsenal of Democracy. He went to Henry Ford and said, Henry Ford, can you please make me tanks and airplanes, because this war is going to be won in the air and on the ground with machines. Henry Ford said, no thanks, I'm still selling some to the Germans, so try someone else. So we went to a guy called Henry Knudsen, who led the Arsenal of Democracy and arranged for American industry to go from producing a few hundred airplanes a year in 1939 to 5,000 heavy bombers. Realistically, if we really hit go and the world's financiers and governments got behind industrial scaling, we could probably get there in about 5 years to be at steady state. I think there's a really interesting, just a couple of anecdotes about this. People worry about what about the solar cells and the batteries and etc. Well, each Australian, each American has about 2,000 kilograms of fossil fuels they burn each year as part of their lifestyle. If we were making enough solar cells and they were lasting 25 years, and enough wind turbines and they were lasting 30 years, and enough batteries, we need about 50 kilograms a year per person of solar, 50 kilograms a year per person of wind, and about 75 kilograms a year per person of batteries, and you'd be there. And that sounds like a lot, but it's an awful lot less than the amount of fossil fuels we're finding, mining, refining, and transporting. And I think so. I think there's some good news stories there. But the good news story is we can still stay under 2 degrees, but honestly, this is the last year to launch something as ambitious as the arsenal of democracy.
Heidi, good answer. Heidi, your Million Jobs plan is interesting because it is focused on trying to address multiple issues at once. What you talk about in that report in all its detail is, well, okay, so how do we address social housing? There's a housing crisis in Australia. How do we address onshore manufacturing? There's an issue with supply and security of supply at the moment in this pandemic. So it struck me that you're being multi-pronged, and in fact the pandemic offers an opportunity. This is an opportunity for a pathway to economic recovery.
I think so. I actually take the view that the most important thing that you can do and what you can learn from an emergency response or a pandemic response is the value of focus, everyone. Focus. And I think that when we take that focus on the future that we have to deliver for a safe climate and for a thriving community and for a great, robust and fair economy, there is only one solution in this, and that is that it won't have carbon emissions in it. We won't be polluting, because you cannot do that in a future scenario with all other things being good, right? It is a key element there. So it will be zero emissions. We take that focus and say, well, that's the future that will happen at some point. What we need to do now is bring that future forward in time. So instead of hitting that zero emissions target at 2050, by we're long past any useful, biosphere at that point, we need to be actually doing that as fast as we can. And what could we do if we just looked at that as our key focus over 5 years? What can you do? And you look at all of the really important contributors and players in our economy. You look at, the efforts to address housing affordability and sustainability and the cost of living for Australians. You say, well, this is an opportunity. How can this also reduce emissions? And there's an answer in the problem itself. We think the same about manufacturing, the same about our transport system. We're particularly interested in the links in between these industries, because that focus on delivering a zero emissions economy means that we have to be able to activate our manufacturing sector to make some of the heat pumps here so that we can put them into the houses that need to replace their gas boilers, so that they can have zero emissions heating. And that you just take that every step of the way. We're going to go upstream, and those factories are going to make the wind turbines and the batteries that go into the equipment. So this, we think, is a real exercise in focus and in collaboration. Let's make what has to happen faster, and just look at all the levers that are available to us right now to achieve that.
Natasha, if I might,
so
we did a similar study in the US, same scope. How do you decarbonize and the job creation? And you'd create 40 million jobs at peak, 25 million in the short term, and 10 million new jobs sustained in the US to fully decarbonize. The interesting thing about those jobs is that the majority
long and short term jobs. I mean, it's easy to throw those figures around, and I know you guys have done the back end modelling, but when you throw those thousands around, people are going, well, are they jobs that I would be able to do? And I'm not a manufacturer, so what can I contribute?
Right. So I was just getting
are they jobs that will last long term?
Absolutely getting to that for you, Natasha. So the majority of those jobs actually end up being in the built environment, and they're unexportable jobs. The majority of the jobs are not actually going to be in solar and wind manufacturing. They're going to be in the installation, and so they're going to look like tradies jobs, and they're going to be in every zip code or every postcode. because it's going to be people driving recognizable white trucks, except they'll be electric, installing solar on your roof, putting heat pumps in your basement, putting car chargers in your garage, and double glazing your windows while they're at it. So that's actually the giant driver here is in local economies, and that is underappreciated and should be shouted from the rooftops. And then to use the historical analog again, the stimulus program that Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to finish the Great Depression with wasn't hugely successful. Unemployment was at about 20%. They started various stimulus packages in 1936, and they got it down to about 17%. With everyone joining the war effort, unemployment went from 17% to about 1.2% in a matter of 1 or 2 years. And so it was that level of war effort that really, and focus that really made the difference. And so that's the difference between sort of vague pussyfooting stimulus packages and actual real commitment and getting the job done on time.
Both Heidi and Saul, Justin, talk about big industries. You know, Saul's argument is that we should, and we might come to this, buy out the proven reserves of fossil fuel companies so that they can then become players in this renewed economy, this renewable economy, because they have the history and the skills. So I'll come back to that because I think that's a very interesting point. Creating a multilateral, bipartisan approach to bringing all the players into this conversation rather than going out with the bad and in with the good sort of thing. And Heidi talks about partnering with big industry too. Do you see, Justin, and certainly individual farmers are part of a growing movement around regenerative agriculture and this focus on, you know, topsoil health and rotating stock, and, you know, there's a really rich conversation there. But do you see a role for big ag? Do you see evidence that big agriculture is wading into this space at scale?
It's not the main thing, you know. Lately, I feel like Microsoft is probably buying carbon and committing to pulling down all their past emissions. And so that's going to be the tech companies are going to get into this. They might end up buying out the old fossil fuel industries. It's interesting.
Wow.
You know, mid-size, I think venture cap, new ag tech is dabbling in this stuff. Certainly precision agriculture, being smarter with fertilizer and using mixed varieties and, you know, elite varieties. There's a lot of good things.
So Microsoft becomes a farming company, hey?
Everybody wants to get into it from food. I'm also kind of bullish on these synthetic or at least plant-based burgers that are going to be displacing factory farms and feedlots and stuff like that too.
Not enough, says Saul. Go on.
I was just going to say, as far as like emergency mobilization in the biotech space, like I think testing for COVID, we had to develop that, and now there's 300 million tests have been done or in the US alone, and you can do that for soil testing too. Then that's coming. We're just doing that in the lab today. I think there's other, you know, disruptive technologies that are going to come faster at the scale, these doublings that Saul's talking about. And I think once we get the models and the satellites, you know, like Elon Musk put up more satellites now than all the governments combined. And so we're going to be able to track tons of carbon, individual trees on landscapes like never before, and that'll allow us to make these changes and employ people. They'll be able to watch what's happening and better monitor and manage their land. And you'll be able to buy your food and know exactly where it comes from in the cities, like New Zealand already has that. Where does the wool sweater, what sheep did that come from? Was it a healthy farm or not? Was the grass green? It's simple questions. You'll be able to get that with a barcode. So.
Oh, and you like historical analogs. So here's one that's not American, although it has a little bit of an American anecdote. There is precedent for buying out fossil fuels. So America and England both had slave problems. America resolved it with a civil war that still has political hangovers today in the United States and endemic racism that's challenging. In Britain, a politician called William Wilberforce led a successful effort to have the banks loan enough money to the British government to buy out all of the slave owners. So he bought the freedom of all of the slaves. Now, that did give a lot of cash to some people who you could arguably say weren't great. And it did take a long time. In fact, it was 2018, hundreds of years later, when those debts were finally paid off. But modern British banking system, which really was revolutionary in the world, was sort of built on these principles. So there's precedents in financing to do this, the precedent in government, and maybe we should say thank you to the fossil fuel industry for 100 years of giving us the good life, and then help capitalize them to get this done. Remember, it's 25 years after the founding of Tesla, and they're producing a tiny fraction of electric vehicles. Startups will not and cannot get this done on the time frame required. This has to be partnerships between startups and industries that are already at scale.
So what role do you see for fossil fuel companies in particular? Because, this is not the way the narrative has gone. And clearly we need a new narrative, don't we? We need to say every player needs a role. And fossil fuel companies have major agency in the way that climate change has been talked about and the way it has been addressed up until now, sometimes in a really problematic way.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure. Justin, yeah.
Well, I've sat in the boardroom with some of the lobbyists of the earth sciences talking about, what's the future of fossil fuel companies? Are they energy companies that are going to shift from non-renewable to renewable, or are they carbon companies that are going to shift from digging it up to sucking it down? And they said, oh, we're not sure yet. Probably some of both, and they're going to wait until all the research is done, all the markets lined up, and the laws have been changed, and the hedge funds have shifted, and the shareholders are demanding it, and then they'll pivot. And they do have the big equipment, they do have the infrastructure, and I've said on other podcasts, the industrial regenerative agriculture would be fine. And that really misses with people's heads. Industrial agriculture is the problem. Fossil fuel companies are the problem. If they become drawdown companies, well, all right,
people misconstrue what these fossil fuel companies are. They're already banks. None of their operations are performed by them. They don't own the discovery and the equipment, and they very rarely operate the mining pads. And so they are literally just arranging long-term financing for these assets and acting as a giant bank. So they already know how to play the game of finance versus fuels, except they're playing on the wrong side of the table.
Let me come to Heidi, and then I'm going to go to questions now because we've got about 20 minutes left. Heidi, let's take an example. So you in the Million Jobs report talk about green manufacturing at length, green steel. You've alluded to that in your presentation. So what do those companies that are getting into that space, what are they saying about why they're getting into that space? What does it take for a kind of juggernaut of a traditional manufacturing company, heavy manufacturing, heavy industry to go, whoop, I'm going to pirouette tomorrow, which is what we're asking people to do?
So when I'm reaching out to industries, like to manufacturers, to talk about these things, I think that there's one kettle of fish, which is the very big resource companies, right? They're very big manufacturers. That's one scale, right? But you end up with a different type of problem. So we're interested in supporting regional communities who have really strong manufacturing base, and they're small and medium enterprises. But by definition, there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of these small and medium manufacturers. And that's where we look at things like just the deployment of replicable technology being the answer to that. And that is the topic that needs support. It needs upfront finance to be able to make the shift from a gas furnace to a heat pump to do your industrial process heat for your factory. You need that because there is no capacity either on your balance sheet or in your knowledge base in your operations to go and do some research and development and go and find your own grants and do all that kind of stuff. So we have a whole lot of stranded capacity if we shift too quickly without taking them all along with us. I think that the opportunity here, and what our research is showing, is that when you approach this as the opportunity and say, well, let's look at what benefits we can provide by scaling up our production of solutions for those small, medium factories, then we can start to see a difference on the ground faster. And it shouldn't be up to individual factories to start to make a fuel switch ahead of the time of these pieces of equipment falling over. Our manufacturers have not been well supported for decades. The industry, the whole sector is shrinking. What we need to see here is an opportunity to step in and say, this is a valuable sector of our economy, these are valuable workers, and we're going to sustain these jobs because they provide skills and they provide products that we're going to need as a country to have this resilience that we're looking for now. Let's approach this as both like the problem and the solution is actually to roll out the technologies that are needed. They're already proven, they're off-the-shelf things. No R&D required here, and you can transition dozens of them. So but BZE, we're really interested in not the ASX 100 or the Fortune 500 companies as much as, so there need to be some of those companies in our renewable ecosystem part, our renewable energy manufacturing precincts, but we can't only have those. We need the whole system, because that's where you're going to start to get those efficiencies of technology and efficiencies of innovation and creativity. They're going to see the R&D propagate to get the new technology on the ground as well.
Okay, there are lots of players in this conversation. A whole of society, every species. Go on. So
I think it's important to point out, I think general audiences often mishear this conversation. I really want to emphasize that the human capital and the physical capital that we're talking about is right now well timed with the actual changeover that we need to see. So imagine we're going to do 50% emission reductions by 2030 and 100% by 2040. That may not be the setup for this conversation, but it's more realistic and it's better than 2050, which is where governments around the world are setting their goals. That's 20 years, which is really a human generation. And so it's not a matter of stopping and the jobs tomorrow. It's just training for different jobs starting tomorrow. And the fossil fleet and the fossil equipment will retire out with the retiring skills over those 2 decades. And we'll be training people as they come into the workforce for these new jobs. And so I think we've got to sort of proactively not allow us to be lampooned as trying to kill all the jobs. We're not, and there will be there still is an opportunity for a reasonable transition on one human generation, one workforce generation.
What we need, of course, is someone to stitch this narrative together, and also to offer the incentives to trigger all sorts of sectors. Education, getting those kids trained up in the skills that they need with the vision a shared vision. We need industry to go, oh, I see a possibility here. There's a market for me here. We need, everyone needs to play. And so a number of
There's even a job for a skilled politician to do that narrative.
Yeah, so let's throw some questions at you from all of you who are joining us on this live stream. Philip, and I'm going to cluster a few of them together, if that's okay, thematically. Philip Sutton has written, how can we get the state governments to commit to a systematic shift to zero emissions by 2030 or sooner? So he's even more ambitious than you. What role should the climate movement play? So that's a role for state governments. Let me just scroll down and grab a few more around the same theme. Jules writes, how do local governments simply communicate the action required for all sectors to meet the true emissions targets? Okay, so that's a role for local governments. What role do they play? And John Engelhardt writes, best mechanism for state governments to influence take-up of battery electric vehicles, addressing equity, given federal government is failing in this policy area, says John. So let's look at the roles of governments.
I could take a local governance. We've been working with Snowy Monero Council and also some of the agricultural down in Bega Valley and stuff like that. And so the councils, I think, especially New South Wales, but all the local government agencies, except for the rural ones, but they manage huge amounts of land and their land use categories and their zoning. And I mean, a lot of, even 1/4 of Western Australia is zoned for agriculture, and you're not allowed to take your sheep or cows off of there. you'll lose your grazing, you'll lose your land. So we need to change the land use categories. I mean, even environmental living, where you say people want to have a nice bush block, and you don't have to farm it. You just plant trees for the sake of it. And there are a lot of biodiversity credits that people, if they're clearing suburbs in Western Sydney, they have to offset that with someplace else. So there's a lot of money and demand out there for these opportunities, but it hasn't been pushed through the local councils. They tend to be, the old farmers are on the councils and they do things the way they have. So, I mean, Beyond Zero Emissions is way ahead now and working with local governments. And I think changing the land use, if I could help in any way with that, it's a real opportunity.
Yeah, and someone has thrown in here, are our ag schools teaching regenerative agriculture in Australia, or is it still considered fringe agriculture? So there's a role for educators. Just back to that question about governments though, Heidi and Saul, your take on what role, you've talked quite a bit about private sector engagement, what role, and industry, what role do governments have here? Because it seems absolutely fundamental. And how do you get them to step outside of the partisan position that they're all taking on this, to talk to each other, to coordinate for the long term?
So it's absolutely critical, and I'll speak a little bit to the American context as well as the Australian. So Rewiring America was founded around making federal policy, state, regional, city policy, and local policies all add up. So in the United States, building codes and zoning are a huge barrier. So the reason that solar in Australia costs $1 and America costs $3 is basically because of permitting issues and local building code issues. Australia also has some of those, and not only on the agricultural front and growing trees, like Justin says, but local councils, particularly around zoning and development, and particularly around building codes and new building codes and retrofits, have a huge role to play. The federal government's biggest levers are in finance. So we need the federal government to step up on finance. It needs to look to history and then be bold. There's not going to be much of an economy left in 2050 if we don't fix this. So they've got to fix it. I'd like them to understand, just as it is for us as individuals, a mortgage is a time machine that lets you have the future you want tomorrow, but lets you have it today. So we need the federal government to basically mortgage. Like, we will win the industries of the future, and Australia is poised to do very well industrially, personally, in terms of agriculture and exports. If we do this boldly, if we don't, we're screwed. So we should be borrowing the money and investing in that future. That's the federal government's role. And then the state governments, in as much as they have big roles in education, they have more context than the federal government to glue it all together. And it's similar in the US. You need federal policy has limited reach beyond what it can do in terms of financing and stimulating state governments to do the right thing. So it can write policies so that the state governments get a larger share of the federal pie if they're moving in the right direction. So we need to actually have those transitions between the various levels of government working together and motivating. And something we're promoting in the US that I think would be good here is sort of a race to the top. So biggest federal piles of money go to the states that are moving the fastest. That would be the type of program you'd like to see.
But of course, being bold means having a bold vision that is shared beyond just one party in one government. It involves a coalition of boldness that transcends party politics, that shares a vision based on the evidence that has been presented to us. So that is challenging. That is the challenge.
Yeah. And that's like a key challenge that we've been really focused on when it comes to articulating this vision that we have, which boldness in spades, but also what we're finding is that, like, no matter which door we're pushing on, it's open, right? Like, we're able to get access because there is an inherent pragmatism and practicality to looking at regenerating our economy by putting people to work building stuff we're going to have one day anyway, it's an undisputable logic to that we're finding can transcend some of these conversations about specifics about, well, what does a solution look like for fossil fuel regions? What does the solution look like for cost of living in our suburbs? And it becomes the same kind of persuasion there. So I think that when we look at the role of government in this, we're looking at the government providing the biggest levers there, scale and speed. Okay, private sector's going there anyway. They're always going to be early movers. People are attracted right now. There's carrots there. We can see that we're moving to a zero emissions economy. People who can move, who can have the resources to capitalise on this, are moving now. Early movers are winning now because they can see the carrots out there. I think that what we don't yet have a shared idea about is just how close that stick is coming up behind us, where we're going to start to find the cost of inaction catching up with us. So for those sectors who haven't moved, our export market is a fantastic example where we are going to get shut out of global markets because we are not providing relevant goods and services. There'll be no demand for things that we currently export mostly.
The demand pull, international investors are pulling us. And that's why, the governments can argue about details and slow the process, but I think the public demand is there, and the finance is shifting, and international demand. Australia get pulled along, and we should be able to get to the front of the pack. Even electric cars, we have all the minerals in this country, and we can refine those with renewable energy. So we're already biggest exporter of lithium. We have huge amounts of nickel. Like, we can reprocess the batteries, right here.
Yeah, the whole lithium story is fascinating, isn't it? From your report, Heidi, we're the world's biggest export of lithium, but we actually, what was it, 0.5% of what was that figure again? And can I just throw into the mix here from Anonymous? Today I got a quote for solar with batteries, and it was $30,000. How do we make this affordable for the middle income and below? And I'm sitting in the middle of a boiling hot house right here with poor insulation, and let me tell you, I have the same question.
Well, I think our answer to that is exactly what Saul is talking about at that macro level, the mortgage, the future right now. So when we look at that, we say that those low bars, and I loved your bar chart where you said, okay, below this median income point, you're not going to be getting a electric car, and you're not going to be getting the savings. So we identified that same income cohort, that household income cohort. They're also the ones that are not going to get another $20,000 or $30,000 on their mortgage. They're not going to extend the mortgage to do some house upgrades because over time it will save them more. We need to make this simple and easy. And one of the things that we have a lot of in the commercial building sector, where most of my work experience is managed energy services contracts, energy performance contracting, where when you build your building and you put your heating and your cooling and your water services in there, the people who design and install those services are responsible for delivering the energy performance, the efficiency that they said they would on the label. Now, that very rarely happens in practice. In the commercial sector, this is stuff that's been around for a while, and it is already in small amounts in the residential sector, but it misses that target audience at the moment, the people who can benefit the most. And also the opportunity to turn our suburbs, where most of our homes are not well built, they're wildly inefficient, we're wasting so much energy. Like Saul says, it's literally 50%.
And Derek has thrown into the mix here. Thanks for your question, Derek, or comment.
I would love the opportunity to tie those two questions together.
And let me just add this from Derek, because I want to get the participants who are posting like fiends. Derek writes, retrofitting solutions such as heat pump double glazing to existing housing stock will be hard. If people have loans, they won't spend more to improve old houses. I have that problem.
That's exactly right. And for that, the energy performance contract actually says you don't pay up front for it. Your retailer, whoever you pay your bills to now, your Origin Energy, that retailer there, they will commit to giving you a set fee for your energy, and they are incentivized then to make your home more and more efficient because they've already billed you at this price and you've signed a contract to say you'll pay that for a number of years. They are then in this theory, it's not Origin, I promise it doesn't exist yet, but in theory, you could then set this same company up who sells you electricity can also come and provide you with your window upgrades. I don't know if you can see my window back there, but that's not, that needs an upgrade. So give you double glazing, look at your draft proofing, upgrade your appliances to efficient induction cooking, upgrade your heater, your water heater to electric, put solar panels on your roof, put your car charger up the front, get your, all of that can be done. And every efficiency gain, that surplus, that gain there, that difference between the fee that you've committed to and what it actually costs gets split then. There's an incentive that can kick back to the company. They get a reward for saving you money instead of a financial reward for making you spend more. We need to remove these split incentives and make more opportunities for people who don't have a $20,000 or $30,000 loan to play with to have affordable, comfortable, zero emissions homes.
That's the California energy market too.
I think
which you've had experience of, Justin, and Saul too.
Where California, I don't think you should really be looking to America for great examples on many things. I'll be straight up. And yes, everyone thinks that the Biden team is going to make Australia move in the right direction. I'm glad they are, but having something of an inside view, Biden team is already setting up to be disappointing on any target mentioned on this show.
Ooh, can we quote you on that?
Sure. Politicians around the world are still, they like round numbers. And so we're setting targets like 2050 and 2060 because they're round, not because they're scientifically based. And that is still happening. But and there is not the type of leadership. Every time you saw Biden or Harris stand up at any debate, they winced after they said climate change or energy, as though they knew it was a difficult cause. We still do not have an orator who can stand up and look the public in the eye and say, we're not there yet. Today, yes, it costs you $30,000 for that solar and battery, but the solar is now economic, the battery isn't. But that's because the battery industry is lagging the maturity of the solar industry by 10 years. It will be there when we launch this mission by 2024, and then I'm going to save you money. And I will subsidize the market and do market shaping and market building with all of the levers of government to get us there. And we need some politician in Australia to stand up and run on that, instead of being essentially shrills for natural gas and the fossil industry, and not expressing a vision. And I think this is really the failure in Australian climate politics, is to tie this to the politics of Parramatta, right? You need to not make it sound like abstract industries that I'm probably not going to go and get a job in. You got to make this sound like you're going to attach it to the good life that I'm going to live in my suburban home, and you're going to improve my household economics. And we still don't have anyone standing up and saying, we can do it. We can now see the point. We can use modeling of the cost reductions of solar, which is still reducing at 19% a year, batteries at 22% a year. And if we get those things by 2024, we can see those savings of $2,500 per Australian household, and that's real savings. So we need a politician to stand up and say, we will shape the market and subsidize the market until we get to that point. Once we're at that point, the market will do it itself. This has to be about financing those things. And then you figure out a mechanism like FDR did in 1930 to tie the value of the economy to those investments in the housing stock. The problem is we don't count the heat pump and the solar on your roof in the value of your home and in the value of your mortgage yet. So the mortgage needs to take a bigger picture, and it needs to finance the batteries in your car, it needs to finance the solar. And when you do those things, you need to see that reflected in the value of your home and real estate. Because let's be very honest about the Australian economy. It's about tradies and it's about home improvement, right? And that's where everyone personally,
you've nailed it. You've been away for a long time, but I think you've probably got it right there.
But that's honestly, so I dare any politician.
I feel like there's a political turn coming on for you, Saul. Is this why you've come back? And
I will run if no party will actually do this. Is this can we have the renewed Greens Party of Australia run on an improve the suburbs bill?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Sally M has written here, where was it? No, anonymous. Politically, it seems like bringing the coal communities on the transition is critical. Who is mapping out a viable alternative future for them? And we saw that with the car industry. We've seen that with go Justin, and with Latrobe Valley here in Victoria. Shut down a coal-fired power station, and what offerings?
I can tell you Newcastle, because they have the equipment to shift from mining fossil fuels to mining basalt. And if you crush rocks and spread it out on farms, it'll weather CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if it runs down into the ocean, it'll, if you go up to the Galilee Basin and you load, instead of black rocks, if you load minerals and put that down, it'll fertilize the Great Barrier Reef. So there's huge new opportunities in carbon drawdown for the same communities that are going to be, and they're the same rural communities that could get into agriculture. And the mines are actually, when they clean up mines, they're some of the leading regen. They have the industries in their back pocket. It's 1 or 2%, you know, it's like a dabbling in it, like greenwashing, but it needs to go. They can do it when they want to.
So I think it's an encouraging stat
Go.
to lead on from that. Like when we looked at our 1.8 million jobs, they're job years, they're over 5 years, they're split, there's construction and ongoing jobs within that. 70% of those can be available in our regions. And like Saul said, the other 30% are looking at distributed jobs through our suburbs, delivering those home improvement savings. The 70% of those jobs can be available in our regions in everything that Justin is talking about, as well as the manufacturing and the transport, and there's still towns and cities out there and homes to improve, and also building out the renewable energy. Like we're not there yet. It's a positive trend, but we need to do more of that and do it faster also.
No, in the US, I know these numbers, and they're not that dissimilar in Australia. There are under 50,000 jobs in coal in the US, and there's $400,000 on golf courses. The largest employment category in the US is the 12.5 million people who work in the food industry. I think we're leading with our chin to discuss a very small number of coal jobs when there's going to be so many jobs everywhere else. And we can and we should, and we have a debt to those people who provide us with cheap energy, manage their transition, job training programs, etc. But there should be no fear that there won't be more jobs and better jobs. And you know, if necessary, we should pay people to retire in these fossil fuel industries. And there's no reason not to. Australia can afford to do it. There's going to be such a boom on the back end of this that I don't have any fear.
When we're looking at specific locations where you could double the manufacturing workforce, where we just put into the government our pre-budget submission, there are 5 locations. We think you could double manufacturing with renewable energy in Gladstone, the Hunter Valley, Bell Bay, Collie, and in Darwin.
My first job was in a blast furnace. My second job was in an aluminum smelter, and my family bought the first coke mill to Wollongong. So I have all of the blood on my... There's a
future for you. There's a job for you as well then, Saul.
I have all the blood on my hands, but I can see, you know, I know what those jobs look like.
I remember visiting those smelters as a materials engineering student at uni, and they were hardcore workplaces. I'm going to throw in 2 final questions and then we should wrap. But the organiser said, oh, this is so good, you're so good, we've got to keep talking. So we're just going a little bit over, folks. So stay with us and we'll probably just go for another 5 minutes and then we'll let you go and walk your dogs. Greg McFarlane wrote here, I've heard when using 20-year GWPs, now I'm assuming that means global warming potentials, animal agriculture is a major greenhouse gas source. Is this true? If so, do we need to cut this sector as well as fossil fuels? So there's another sector that Greg is proposing needs some kind of transition from his perspective. Any thoughts, Justin?
Yeah, definitely. I think methane is always, diluted over 100 years. And in the near term, the 20-year term, methane's 80 times more potent than CO2. But just demand reduction, I think that's the biggest one.
You know, people were patting themselves on the back about the Paris Agreement and countries, you know, nominating voluntary commitments, et cetera, but then it became clear that we're screwed if we don't act fast and now and actually have much more ambitious goals than what the Paris Agreement has laid out for nation states. So how do we stop the climate movement from backing crap goals, such as, now I think this is net zero by 2050 or even 75% by 2030 reduction, I guess. So you know, how do we actually talk truth here?
Everyone needs to remember that the commitments that are being made are getting better every year. Right? So what used to be 2100 is 2060, and what used to be 2060 is 2050, and 2050 becomes 2040. And, you know, then all of a sudden you have Boris Johnson, who is hardly the bastion of climate forward, saying no more electric vehicles in England by 2030. So although none of the global...
No more petrol vehicles, you mean?
No more petrol vehicles. No more That's right. No, so we are nowhere near on target, and the commitments are nowhere near good enough, but they are getting better every year. And you have to remember, the economics really do flip this decade. The only project you need to run to make the economics flip in every industry and for every sector is to do these things at scale, right? Every time you double the size of solar production, the cost comes down 19%. Double battery production, cost comes down 22%. Everything's going to be 2 or 3 or 4 times cheaper once we're doing it at the right scale. So that's going to flip the politics. I can imagine conservative governments around the world in 2024 winning government on a platform of the free market has spoken and clean energy is the cheapest.
All right. Because then I've got a question for the kids. So you're sticking around.
Oh,
kids.
Fantastic! You stick around. You're going to ask questions. All right. So here's the rub. There's going to be a lot of money to be saved at the household level. There are 3 sets of people setting up to take that pot of money home with them. One is going to be the AGLs and the existing utilities. One is going to be these middle financing companies that want to lease you the thing but take the economic benefit. And the other person or group that we could have take home this economic payday is the homeowner and the household itself, right? If you want this to be done equity, we need to always choose the policy where the economics favor the householder. And we've got to prevent this from being a land grab by the utilities and by middle market players trying to realize those household savings on their balance sheet.
I'm going to say that is a yes and conversation. This is the kind of situation that I think promotes the political divide that we see, right? What we're looking for here is actually the yes and. Why can't there be a kickback for the retailers that are doing the right thing? Why can't there be savings for households at exactly the same time? And why can't you win when you run an election campaign based on savings for householders in our suburbs? Like, this is something that we can make happen. And I think that the role of the climate movement that you're asking, the environmental groups out there, is to make sure that we're supporting the right ideas and not getting ideological about who we're going to support. And we'll never support them because they belong to a particular breed of politician that we don't agree with. Support the right ideas and support them loudly and proudly, because that is the way that we're going to shift the public narrative and support for the right things to happen that we need to happen really fast.
Look, fantastic conversation. I just love the level of detail, because we need this detail now. We need specificity in every one of these conversations. And I would argue in the media as well, every interview needs to be full of specificity around this issue. What one thing would you like to see done to fix climate change? One thing, just one thing. Have a think about it. Saul, what do you reckon? Saul's son, what's your name?
My name is Huxley.
Hey, Huxley, how you going? Hope you're enjoying being in the Wollongong.
Yeah, I'm all right.
What one thing would you like to see done
What if every
to fix
kid got an
climate
electric
change?
go-kart and it was illegal to drive electric go-karts to school because we dedicated a traffic lane to light electric vehicles?
Can I drive one too? Go on. Huxley, it's your
That would be great, but like, I just feel like, I mean, I don't know much about like all these things and the average household stuff, but like, I don't know. I just do whatever helps the most, just as a whole in general, because like, if we screw it up, then there won't, it'll be harder to, do go-karts and stuff like that. So probably whatever helps the most. I don't know.
Thanks very much, Huxley.
But my dad probably would.
Thanks, man. Thanks.
Oh, I'm looking forward to you taking over from all of us. And Justin's daughter has just joined us. Hey, how are you? Thanks for joining us. We were just going to put it to you. What one thing would you like to see done to fix climate change? It's a big question. It can be a little answer.
I want to see the government actually listen to us and pay attention more to our lives and what we want to live in.
That's a great
Thank you so much. What was your name? What's your name?
Eva.
Eva, thanks so much for that. And Heidi's children have joined us too. What about you? Hello. I could hear you and the puppy dog out the back. What about you? What would you like to see done to fix climate change? Well, just one little thing.
Trees is the whisper. We like trees. We like trees.
I'm up for trees.
And I have to say, like, in answer to both these questions, the go-kart and the optimism, follow us on Twitter if you don't already. It's at Beyond Zero News. And if you had been following us today, you would see one of our staff members driving around an electric go-kart, looks like, in Newcastle right now, working with companies who are already shifting the dial and making all their operations electric and making electric vehicles for heavy industry. And these
this whole conversation is about Eve and Huxley and your children, Heidi. That's what it's all about. You know, we're passing on the baton to you. So I look forward to your leadership on the issue too, and I hope we can do everything to support you as you grow up and become adults and sort stuff out. It's been my great privilege to read all of your work, and I hope that many others do, because it's very detailed and very inspiring. Dr. Saul Griffith, founder and chief scientist of Other Lab and founder of Rewiring America, Heidi Lee, CEO of Beyond Zero Emissions, and Professor Justin Borwitz from the ANU. That rounds off the RESET.21 Forum series. Thank you so much for joining us. You can go back to the website climateemergencysummit.org and check out the videos of all these sessions and stay in touch with what the organisers are doing as part of the Sustainable Living Festival. But keep talking, keep acting, and for now, good night, stay safe. See you from lockdown Melbourne, folks. Take good care. Bye.